with your meals is not such a bad thing. Solid foods tend to be slower than liquids. Cold foods tend to be slower than hot foods. Even the type of sugar or the type of carbohydrate makes a difference. Certain sugars, certain starches are just naturally faster to digest than others. I was always confused by this because I thought a starch is a starch. What's the difference? But there are certain starches called branch chain starches that are much slower, much faster to digest than straight chain starches. For example, lentils are much slower to digest than things like potatoes and rice. They're starchy, but they take longer to break down. So they looked at two different scenarios. Let's first consider the yellow graphs. A meal with, let's say, 50 grams of carb in the form of potato causes a much higher spike than a mixture of potato and lentils. And let's look at white rice. Same thing. You can get a big spike after the meal. You combine rice with lentils, same amount of carb, less of a spike after the meal. I don't go and memorize long lists of glycemic index scores. I prefer to just kind of group things in categories. There are certain things that we know are very fast. Some we know are very slow, and most other things just kind of fall in the middle. The fast stuff includes chips and crackers, snack foods, potatoes, rice, breads, cereals, and most sugary candies fall in that category. The very slow stuff includes pasta, particularly pasta that's still firm, that's not overcooked. Legumes, things like nuts, peas, lentils, salad vegetables, dairy products, and chocolate because of its fat content. Those are going to be much slower to digest. And then most other things are going to sort of fall in the middle, and most mixed meals fall in the middle as well. So it's just a matter of making some common sense substitutions. If you're used to having cereal for breakfast and you're seeing a spike, consider oatmeal, or better yet, consider yogurt, which is much slower to raise the blood sugar. And these are some examples of some substitutions that can be easily made at different meals. Now, for example, with snack foods, rather than chips, crackers, pretzels, have things like whole fruit or popcorn or nuts or chocolate. I don't think your child would be too upset if you said, instead of having chips for a snack, we're going to start having ice cream. I don't know too many kids would be put off by that sort of thing. Another strategy for slowing down the appearance of food after a meal is to split the meal. There's no rule that says when you sit down to a meal and you take your insulin that you have to eat the whole meal at once. It's reasonable to have part of your meal after taking your insulin and then another part of it an hour, hour and a half later. You take all of the insulin up front, but since the insulin is taking several hours to work, you can eat your food over time as well. So for example, if you're having a large sandwich, you could split that sandwich, have half of it with your, right after taking your insulin, and the other half, have it a little while later. Now, this is as fancy as I've ever gotten with PowerPoint creativity, so enjoy that. Another way to slow down the rate of digestion is to engage in some physical activity after eating. Physical activity causes the body to divert blood flow away from the stomach and intestines and towards the muscles. So food digests more slowly than somebody who's physically active after they eat. Acidity will also slow down the rate of digestion. Adding a little bit of vinegar to the meal or just having a spoonful of vinegar will slow it down. And acidic foods like tomatoes and sourdough products will also cause a slower rate of digestion to occur. The sequence in which meals are consumed makes a difference. Eating your protein and vegetables before the starchy part of the meal causes kind of like a gel matrix to form in the intestines, and the carbs don't digest and absorb quite as quickly. There's also research that shows that having your high carb meal in the middle of the day rather than early or late will produce less spiking in meals overall. We tend to be a little more sensitive to our insulin, and it might work more effectively in the middle of the day. There are medicinal approaches that can be used to slow down the rate of digestion. I mentioned before that this hormone called GLP-1 is present in low levels in people with diabetes, but these medications are available to be taken by injection. Now, there's an oral version of one of these that is in development, but right now they're injectables. Some of them are injected daily, some are injected once weekly, but they definitely slow down the rate of digestion. And I mentioned the amylin hormone earlier. This hormone is available in a hormone replacement therapy in a product called Simlin. Now, this has to be taken before each meal. It can cause some nausea and some other side effects, so it hasn't been very popular. But I have found that this is one of the most powerful ways to slow digestion and produce flat blood sugars after meals. So if nothing else seems to work, this is an option. Also mentioned before when we looked at some of the examples of how low blood sugar can often produce highs. One of the ways that happens is it causes the stomach to empty faster. Gastric emptying is accelerated when you're in a state of hypoglycemia. And that's a good thing. And we want food to digest quickly so the blood sugar comes up. But if you're a little low going into a meal, it means you're going to spike that much more than usual. So avoiding lows going into meals is beneficial in another way. Now let's talk about how we can get the insulin to work a little bit earlier. Obviously, the kind of insulin you use makes a difference. If you're having spikes after meals and you're still using regular insulin, consider switching to one of the rapid-acting analog insulins like NovoRapid or Humalog. The action curve of these is much faster, it peaks earlier, it starts earlier, and it clears sooner. You can even go a step further. There are new ultra-rapid insulins. Lilly has a version called Lyumjev. Novo Nordisk has a version called Fiasp. Now, these don't make a radical difference because they only peak about 5 to 10 minutes earlier, but you are likely to see some improvement in your postprandial glucose using these instead of the normal rapid insulin analogs. Personally, I found that these work great for those on injections. For those who are on pumps, it can be sometimes a little bit challenging. We sometimes see more clogging with these in pumps and sometimes some long-term site issues with the absorption patterns. The timing of the insulin is something you also have control over. Most people take their insulin and eat immediately, or take their insulin during or after their meal, and that's not ideal. Because even rapid-acting insulin takes about 15 minutes just to start working, and it takes about 60 to 90 minutes to peak, it's necessary to give the insulin a head start. In most cases, giving the insulin about 15 minutes before eating is going to work much better. Now, obviously, if your glucose is low or close to being low or dropping quickly going into a meal, you don't want to take it well in advance. You can take it with the meal or after. But assuming your glucose is fine, pre-dosing, pre-bolusing is going to be to your advantage. This was my own sensor data going back almost 20 years. I was the one having those spikes after the meals. And I decided when I saw that, I'm going to start giving my insulin earlier. And you can see how much it limited the post-meal peaks. Research 15, 16 years ago even showed that people taking their insulin before meals had better post-meal control than those who took it after meals. The difference in the post-meal peak was significant. And this leads to an improvement in the hemoglobin A1C. In this research, people were instructed to take their insulin 15 to 30 minutes pre-meal, but only if their glucose was above 150, which is about an 8 in millimole. And even doing that, A1Cs came down about 0.2 to 0.4, and that was a long-term sustained change. Warming or massaging an infusion site or an injection site will also help the insulin absorb faster. Warming or massaging the site brings blood vessels to the skin surface where they absorb the insulin faster. So this is a good excuse to, if you're an adult listening, ask your partner to give you a massage after you take your shot. good reason to get a massage. The site where the insulin is injected or infused also does matter. There is some research that shows that even rapid-acting insulin absorbs a little bit faster when it's given on the arm or the abdomen as compared to the thigh or the buttocks. There's simply more blood vessel proliferation below the skin on the arm and the abdomen than there is on other parts of the body. There is an inhaled version of insulin called Afrezza. Afrezza comes in a device that looks like a little whistle. You inhale a powdered form of the insulin. It inhales into the deep lung, and it works much faster than insulin that's given below the skin. When we give insulin below the skin, it has to spend time absorbing through the fat layer to reach the blood vessels. Afrezza reaches the bloodstream directly through the lungs. There's not that added delay. So we see peak effects that occur much earlier with Afrezza and post-meal glucose control that's much, much tighter than with normally injected or pumped insulin. Another option that we do have is an intramuscular injection of insulin. I mean, historically, we've tried to avoid injecting insulin into muscle because A, it stings. It is a somewhat painful injection. And B, we worry that the insulin would work too quickly. But if your blood sugar is particularly high and you want to bring it down fast, you could always inject it into a muscle. It will come down that much quicker. In fact, it works about twice as fast when the insulin is given into muscle compared to the fat layer. IM is intramuscular, SQ is subcutaneous fat. So you can see the difference in how long it takes to bring a high blood sugar down using a muscular injection instead of giving it into fat. Here's an example. In my own case, I gave myself an injection into muscle. I was actually in Europe doing a presentation. I guess I was a little bit nervous. My sugars were very high. And I gave myself a shot into muscle. And you can see it only took about an hour to an hour and a half to completely come down. So it does work much quicker. Another strategy to keep the insulin working quickly is to not smoke. Cigarette smoking causes constriction of blood vessels, particularly blood vessels near the skin surface. And when that happens, insulin is going to absorb much more slowly. There's plenty of reasons not to smoke, but this is just one more for you. And here's physical activity again. We already talked about how it can slow the rate of digestion. Physical activity will also accelerate insulin absorption. The blood vessels in the skin dilate when we're physically active. And they do that so that the body can cool itself. But by dilating, they also absorb the insulin more quickly. So getting some physical activity after a meal will help improve the post-meal control. It doesn't take a lot. And this was research that just showed 30 minutes of stop and go walking. I mean, this is like walking your dog where they stop at every post, pole, and box. Stop and go walking produced a significant, almost a 2-point reduction in the post-meal blood sugar peak. And these are some examples of the kinds of activity that you can do after meals. Walking a pet. If you have a pet that needs to be walked, do it after a meal. If you have chores to do, labor-intensive chores, do it after a meal. I realized this, doing the dishes, I had much better control after dinner. My wife got wind of that. She has me do the dishes every night now. She says it's therapeutic for me. She does it for me. If you are going to exercise and want to improve your control after a meal, do the workout after the meal. You probably will also need to reduce your mealtime insulin, but you'll have much less of a spike after the meal if you do the exercise then. If you have shopping to do, do it after a meal. Same with gardening. Just taking a casual stroll or dancing. Dancing is a great form of exercise. It's aerobic. Even things like bowling, mini golf, skating, or for the kids out there, those of you with kids, this is a good time to go beat up your sister, beat up your brother, fight with them, whatever you're going to do. So if you're going to do that, wait until after dinner, and you'll see better blood sugar control as a result. So to put this together, these post-meal blood sugars are very important to control. It affects our quality of life day in and day out. Our ability to function optimally and feel good hinges on keeping the glucose stable. And our long-term health is certainly affected by the constant spikes and peaks and valleys in glucose levels. We can measure these post-meal peaks in a variety of ways, ranging from finger sticks to using a continuous glucose monitor to various lab tests. And they're manageable. We have so many ways to improve the management of the post-meal glucose. We can apply glycemic index principles. We can split the meal, sequence the meals properly, eat the slower digesting foods first, add a little acidity to the food. There are medication options to help slow digestion. We can engage in physical activity after a meal. In terms of the insulin, we can use the faster acting analog insulins. We can give the insulin ahead of time, warming the site where the insulin is injected or infused. Use body parts that tend to absorb the insulin faster, or utilize inhaled insulin instead of injected insulin. You can inject insulin into muscle instead of fat. Don't smoke. And again, engage in the post-meal physical activity. So there's plenty of ways of managing post-meal glucose. I'm not suggesting you go out and do every one of these right now, but try a few of them. If they don't work, try other things or try additional things until you get to where you want to be. So I have my company website, my email, my phone number all here. If people have follow-up questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions that are sent to me by email. And I think we have a little bit of time to take questions now. And I'll also mention, if anybody's looking for some additional help with their diabetes management, let us know. We work with people all over the world through video, phone. We've been doing this for almost 20 years now, virtual, remote type consultations. So we're available to you if you need us.
Thank you very much, Gary. That was incredibly helpful. My big take from that is that my son needs to do more chores after dinner. So thanks for that. That's awesome. There are actually
he's going to love me.
Well, there seems to be what? As well with the chocolate as well. So there's a few other things that he can take from that too. We do have some questions. We have had some, so I'm just going to run through a couple now, if that's okay, Gary. Lorna has asked, can we obtain its GLPL, is it one, or amylin without a prescription?
No, the medications that I mentioned, the GLP-1 receptor agonists, the Symlin, those are prescription medications.
Okay.
So you'll need to work with your physician or your clinical team. Some physicians and clinical teams are supportive of using these, even in children. Some are not. So you'll have to ask them and ask for their reasoning as well. I'm sure they have good reasons for what they do.
Thank you very much. Where would you recommend we inject if we're injecting into a muscle?
What I've tried, I've done my forearm. If you flex make a tight fist, you can inject right into the forearm. You can also flex your arm and do the tricep. I've had some patients who have very lean legs will do it in their calf muscle. I mean, I wouldn't do it on a routine basis. I've seen people get a lot of bruising and whatnot, and it is uncomfortable. But if you do it, use it for special circumstances. Like I said, if you have an unusually high blood sugar that's stubborn to come down, if you have maybe a pump infusion site failure and you need to get insulin in your system very quickly, it can be a good option.
Great, thank you. Another one, I've heard of Afrezza. Did you say Afrezza? I can't remember how you pronounce it, but I haven't come across anyone using it. Is it popular? Why or why not? Although I did see in the chat that someone had mentioned that it's not actually available here in the UK.
Mm-hmm. That may be the case. It's been available in the States for several years. It's not widely popular, I think mainly because the dosing is a little difficult. You can't dose in very small increments with it. So it's not used by a lot of children because of that. But I mean, if you can access it and want to give it a try, it's pretty interesting, and it is very effective for controlling post-meal sugars better.
Maybe a silly question. No such thing as a silly question. Why do we not inject insulin intravenously?
Oh, that is a silly. No, it's not silly. No, injecting insulin intravenously can be enormously dangerous. Uh, the insulin will work almost immediately, and we're talking seconds. And that large a dose of insulin working all at once can cause severe hypoglycemia, life-threatening hypoglycemia in an instant. Also, any bit of air that you might inject can cause an embolism that can go to the brain and kill you. So, I mean, it's just
Two very good reasons, really. Right.
yeah.
But no,
If you value your life, don't inject into it.
I'm pleased you asked that question though, because that was an interesting answer. Sophie has asked, do you advise schools about how to support a pupil with their diabetes?
Yeah, all the time. And different schools have different resources, and the legalities vary from school to school and from territory to territory. But yeah, there's always ways to negotiate with your nurse, your school district, on how to be more proactive. I find most of the time the school nurses are very accommodating when they're approached with respect and it's done in a collaborative manner. If you go in, guns blazing, saying, I want this, there's always going to be pushback. It has to be done in a collaborative way.
Okay, great. Do you recommend super bolusing, where some basal from later in the morning is added to the breakfast bolus?
Yeah, I'm glad someone brought that up. The super bolus was a concept developed by John Walsh, who wrote the pumping insulin books. And his theory was that you can turn off your pump's basal insulin for several hours at a meal, and then give that insulin you would have received as a bolus. That way you have more insulin working soon after the meal and less working a few hours later. My experience with it and my patient's experience with it is, it doesn't usually make enough of a difference in terms of controlling the post-meal blood sugar to add a little bit to that meal bolus, and B, it tends to cause problems hours later when you have little to no insulin in your body and your body is still producing its own glucose or still digesting a meal, and the blood sugar winds up shooting up really high. So for the limited amount of benefit and the problems it can cause, we just generally aren't recommending it.
Great, thank you very much. Paul from Stevenage, or just up the road from me, I'm in St Albans, Paul. Is there any specific advice for pumpers?
Well, the advice for pumpers is very similar to the advice for people on injections. I mean, with a pump, you have the same exact challenges. One thing you can do more easily with a pump is you can pre-bolus even if you don't know how much carb you're going to eat, because at the end of the meal, you can just kind of pay the balance. You can cover the carbs you didn't cover with that initial bolus. With injections, you end up having to give multiple shots. It's also easier to pre-bolus just from a convenience standpoint. You can program your pump with reminders. So if your breakfast is at 8:30, you can program your pump to give you a reminder at 8:15 or 8:10 to give your bolus. So there's certain advantages the pump offers for those who are trying to control their post-meal spikes.
I certainly find using the pump has been a game changer for us, and certainly with pizzas and things like that. Do you think both commercial and DIY AP systems are effective at combating post-meal highs?
Well, no. I don't think that the commercial or DIY systems do any more for combating post-meal spikes than conventional systems do. They can ramp up the basal insulin if you're starting to climb after a meal and the system doesn't think you have enough bolus to cover it. So in that sense, ultimately, you may not wind up quite as high. But even when you're using a hybrid closed loop system or a DIY system, you're going to have to be conscientious about pre-bolusing. You can't get around that. And you have to think about a lot of the other strategies we discussed if you don't want your sugars to spike. I use a DIY system personally, and I've just learned from experience, if you fall into bad habits, your blood sugar control is still going to suffer.
Great, thank you. we have, why is the breakfast post-meal spike particularly big compared to the others?
Great question. Yeah, that is the case for most people. Morning time is when the spikes tend to be the highest. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that first thing in the morning, the body is producing these things called counter-regulatory hormones that are part of the dawn cycle. Those keep insulin from working as effectively as usual, and they slow down insulin's actions. So insulin's basically a little sluggish in the morning. The other problem is what we tend to eat for breakfast. Typical breakfast foods are of the high glycemic index variety. Any kinds of breads, baked goods, things like that, cereals, these all digest extremely fast. Foods we eat later in the day with salads and whatnot, and protein portions, we don't have a lot of that at breakfast. So food tends to digest a little faster in the morning. And that's the other, this is the third thing. When you come off of a fast, your food is going to naturally digest quicker. So if you skipped breakfast, your blood sugar would probably spike very high at lunch. That first meal of the day is going to naturally digest a little quicker than the others.
That's interesting. Which insulin have you personally found best for looping?
I haven't found much of a difference. I've tried using the ultra rapid insulin like Fiasp and didn't find it that helpful. In fact, I found some site absorption issues using it long term. So the traditional Humalog Novo Rapid seemed to work well enough with the loop system that I use.
Lorna, how would we find out more about opportunities to work with you privately?
Oh, send me an email and I'll have my, either me or my office manager can get back to you.
Fantastic. Okay, that's great. I think that is all the questions that we have had asked during the system. It looks like we're just reaching the end of the time session now. So thank you so much, Gary. That's been a really interesting talk, and we've all, I think, taken quite a lot from that. So
Pleasure was mine. Thanks. Thank you.
thank you. Bye-bye.